So what are some of these drawbacks towards using virtual autopsies? Well, the number one drawback is going to be cost, particularly financial cost. When you're looking at procuring this equipment, you're not going to have very many medical examiners' offices or coroner's offices that can run out and buy an MRI machine or a CT scanner. MRI machines can cost upwards of $1 million. CT scanners, $500,000 or more. Now, if your office wants to combine the internal digital images it gets from these machines with an external scan of the corpse, there's another $100,000, $200,000 in surface scanning equipment. And of course, there are the costs in time of hiring new people, training technicians, getting this technology used in your office, having standard operating procedures developed. So in terms of cost, that is one of the major factors why it hasn't become necessarily commonplace in the United States for virtual autopsies to be used. Another problem related to the use of the virtual autopsy is what I'll describe as the perceived infallibility of computers. When you are using a computer to generate evidence, you can lull everyone from the lay juror to an experienced law enforcement professional into this false sense of security. The computer made the evidence, I'm sure it's perfect and fine. But you always have to keep in mind that computers can break, users and technicians can make mistakes. So that's something to be considered when you're looking at this evidence. There is room for human error. And this comes from the fact that the process of creating a digital image, although most of it's done by a computer, assimilated within the computer, it's not entirely 100% automated. You do need technicians to come in and make minor adjustments in the equipment to make sure that the images that you're getting are clear and accurate. A good example of this is the fact that when you are imaging a deceased person, the technician must account for the fact that the body temperature is lower than that of you or I, of a living person. So that's an area where human error can be introduced into the process. Another drawback to virtual autopsies is just the fact that they're new, the inherent newness of virtual autopsies. In other words, they aren't widely accepted and used everywhere. So as such, they're going to be facing a heightened level of scrutiny and criticism, and that's just something to keep in mind with any new forensic technologies. Now, in a medical sense, one of the biggest drawbacks to virtual autopsies, outside of the cost, of course, is the fact that they can't always detect every cause of death. In particular, natural deaths are very difficult to detect, like a heart attack, and unnatural deaths that were caused by poisons or toxins. You're still going to need to do a traditional toxicological exam. You're not going to be able to find out whether or not someone was poisoned by arsenic with a digital imaging scan. Now, I had mentioned this briefly before, but I'd like to highlight it again. When you get these images, it gets very exciting. They're clear graphics. You think, oh, this is the best autopsy in the world. You still have to follow up with a visual examination of the deceased person's clothing, any kind of alleged weapon, or things of that nature. So, perhaps one of the things to keep in mind is that virtual autopsies, as great as they are potentially more of a supplement to a traditional autopsy rather than replacing the entire traditional autopsy process. At least that appears to be the status as of now. And with all these, the benefits of virtual autopsies and the drawbacks of virtual autopsies, with all that in mind, one of the things that I'd like to discuss next is, well, if virtual autopsies are going to be used in the United States, what kind of legal issues are they going to face as proponents of the evidence try and enter these kinds of reports into our case systems? Legal issues. The legal issues related to virtual autopsies. Yes, they are not widely used in the United States, but that doesn't mean that they may not be in the future, which means that as attorneys and attorneys in training, you're going to want to kind of issue spot what are some of the problems that this kind of evidence may face when proponents of the evidence try and introduce it into court. And there is a host of things I could talk about. I could talk about privacy issues or chain of custody issues. But really, I'm only going to focus on two aspects of virtual autopsies that could cause some issues for people trying to use this evidence in a criminal or civil investigation. The first issue that we're going to talk about is the fact, and I've mentioned it before, virtual autopsies are new. In a sense, they're a new and novel scientific or technical technique. And as such, courts are going to want to make sure that they're sufficiently reliable to be introduced into court, that they're not junk science, so to speak. Why is this important? Well, jurors really like pictures. There have been study after study showing that people can often find computer evidence and pictorial evidence as almost infallible. So if you're going to introduce that kind of evidence, you really need to make sure that there is no error, that it is reliable. So in terms of this first issue of virtual autopsies, that it's a new scientific technique, what that means for you as an attorney and as an attorney in training is that you may encounter a Frye or Daubert analysis, a hearing request on this kind of evidence. Now, if you're in a Frye jurisdiction, like Florida, you are just going to have to establish that virtopsies are generally accepted in the relevant scientific community. What's the relevant scientific community? Well, that means that coroners, medical examiners, pathologists, forensic radiologists, that they accept this kind of technique as valid science. Now, if you're in a different jurisdiction, a Daubert jurisdiction, or one of the jurisdictions that uses a hybrid of Daubert, the rule of thumb for admission of scientific or technical knowledge is a little bit different. It's not the general acceptance so much as a list of factors that the courts will consider. And remember, in a Daubert jurisdiction, you have the judge acting much more as a gatekeeper. So the judge is going to look at particular issues such as, has the technique been tested? Has it been subject to peer review analysis? Is there a defined error rate for virtopsies? Are there standard operating procedures for using the technique? And yes, of course, they will also look at whether or not the relevant community has generally accepted this kind of technology. So in addition to this first issue of virtual autopsies, this issue that, well, hey, they're new, they're novel, it's a new scientific technique, we're going to want to make sure it's not junk science, there's also another element to virtual autopsies that may raise some legal scrutiny, and that's the fact that virtual autopsies are, in a sense, a reconstruction, a computer-generated reconstruction of forensic evidence. And the fact that there is a reconstruction process means that you have to keep in mind the issue of what's called authentication, proving that the digital images are in fact what they purport to be. And you can see why courts, again, would be interested in making sure that this is established, because when you are using a computer and these digital imaging technologies, there are actually several opportunities, as mentioned in prior sections of this video, for human error, for corruption. The hardware can break. Perhaps the user, the technician, wasn't properly trained. Things of that nature. So before, when we were talking about Frye and Daubert, we're looking at the reliability of the scientific or technical underlying aspects of virtual autopsies. Here we're looking more at the process. That's one way to differentiate the two.